At my son's wedding, my new daughter-in-law slapped me across the face in front of 300 guests. She looked at my stinging cheek and told me to get out, said nobody wanted a washed-up old woman ruining her perfect night. My son just stood there and watched it happen. He had no idea that with one single phone call, I was about to unravel his entire marriage, seize the family fortune propping up his new wife, and turn their dream wedding into the beginning of her downfall. I am Marguerite Aucaffer-Lane, 68 years old, and the quiet founder of one of the largest boutique hotel groups on the Eastern Seaboard. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled the people who humiliated me, tell me what city you're listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe disrespect should always be met with consequences. Now let me take you back to the exact second my family shattered, and my empire went to work. The string quartet was midway through a waltz when the sound cracked across the ballroom, sharp as a rifle shot. It sucked every ounce of air out of the room. The cellist froze with her bow lifted. The violinist's hand slipped off the strings entirely. 300 guests in silk and tailored linen went utterly still, the way a forest goes still right before a storm breaks. I was standing near the dessert table holding a flute of champagne I never got to drink, and I felt my own cheek before I understood what had happened to it. It stung like fire. My reading glasses had flown off my face and hit the polished parquet floor, one lens cracking clean in half. I am not an easily rattled woman. I built a hospitality empire out of a single roadside inn I bought with my late father's life insurance money, back when nobody believed a black woman from a coastal fishing town could run so much as a breakfast counter, let alone 11 luxury properties from Savannah to the Hamptons. I have negotiated with investors who tried to strong-arm me out of my own boardroom. I have buried a husband and raised a son alone while running a company worth more than most people will ever see in their lifetimes. I do not rattle, but standing there with blood beginning to bead along a thin cut on my cheekbone, courtesy of the massive emerald-cut diamond on my new daughter-in-law's hand, I felt something in me go very, very cold. Standing over me was Odalise, 27 years old, poured into a custom gown that cost more than a year of a teacher's salary, her face twisted from wedding day radiance into something ugly and sneering. "Get out of here, old woman," she said, loud enough that it carried to the back tables. "Nobody wants you here. You're embarrassing me." Odalise came from a family that called itself Old Newport Money, the Ashfords, the kind of people who smile with their teeth bared like a warning. She believed my son was marrying beneath his own name by attaching himself to a hotel lady who used to scrub toilets in her own properties when she couldn't afford staff. She had no idea that the seaside estate hosting her reception, the one her father had bragged about booking for $80,000 a night, was owned outright by a holding company with my name buried 3 layers deep in the paperwork. She thought we were furniture. She was about to learn we were the foundation. I glanced toward the family table, where Odalise's parents, Bertrand and Celeste Ashford, sat sipping wine like nothing had happened. They didn't rush over. They didn't apologize. Celeste dabbed at her lipstick in a compact mirror. Bertrand murmured something to the man beside him, and the two of them chuckled. To them, I was the help who'd overstepped, funding a party I had no right to attend as an equal. Then I looked at my son. Desmond Jr., 29 years old, standing not 4 feet from the woman who had just struck his mother in front of everyone he'd ever wanted to impress. This was the boy I nursed through asthma attacks at 2 in the morning. The boy I put through the finest boarding schools, the boy I shielded from every hard edge of the world so he would never have to know what it felt like to be underestimated the way I had been. I waited for him to move. I waited for him to grab his bride's wrist and demand she apologize. I waited for 30 years of raising him right to show up in that one single moment. He did nothing. He stared at his shoes. His knuckles went white around his champagne glass. He would not look at me. He would not look at his mother's bleeding face. The silence coming off him was its own kind of violence. In that frozen second, something in me that had loved him unconditionally for 29 years simply closed, like a door being locked from the inside. I did not scream. I did not lunge. Women who build empires out of nothing do not throw tantrums in public. We calculate, and then we execute. I set my champagne flute down on a passing tray with a hand that did not shake. I walked the length of that ballroom, while 300 wealthy strangers parted for me like I was something to be afraid of. I knelt in front of Odalis's designer heels and gathered the shattered pieces of my glasses so no one would cut themselves. I pulled a handkerchief from my clutch and pressed it to my own cheek. My hand was steady. My mind was already 10 steps ahead. I stood, looked Odalise dead in the eye, and gave her nothing. No tears, no rage, no scene for her to spin into a story about the unhinged black mother-in-law. I turned to my son, held his gaze for exactly 1 second, long enough for him to understand that I saw him, all of him, and then I turned my back on both of them. I pulled my phone from my clutch, dialed a number that connects directly to my chief of operations, a woman named Priya who has worked for me for 18 years and who answers her phone at any hour, day or night. She picked up on the first ring. "Priya," I said, my eyes still on the room. "Activate contingency blue." I hung up and slid the phone back into my clutch. Odalise let out a short, mocking laugh, certain I was some old woman calling a car service to slink home in shame. Her laugh died in her throat 8 seconds later, when the heavy glass doors at the rear of the ballroom sealed shut with a mechanical clunk, and the green exit signs above them flickered to red. The lights went out 5 seconds after that. Not a flicker, not a brownout, total darkness, followed by the cold hum of emergency lighting kicking in, the harsh industrial kind meant for stairwells, not wedding receptions. The soft golden glow of the chandeliers was gone, replaced by unforgiving white light that made every carefully applied layer of makeup in the room look like a mask slipping. Odalise spun in a circle, shouting for someone to explain what was happening. My son pulled out his phone and found no signal. The estate's event security system had signal dampeners installed for exactly this kind of high-value gathering, and contingency blue had just switched them on. We were sealed off from the outside world, and I was the only person in the building holding the key. From the shadows near the kitchen doors, a man in a dark suit stepped forward with a wireless microphone. His name was Ruben, my head of event security for 11 years, a man who does not flinch. He looked at no one but me. I gave him a single nod. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ruben announced, his voice flat and clinical, "due to an immediate and irreversible payment failure, all vendor services for this event have been terminated, effective now. Catering, music, and staff are officially off duty. This property is closing. You have 10 minutes to vacate before local police arrive to handle any remaining trespassers." Chaos erupted instantly. Women in gowns shrieked. Men shouted at waitstaff who had already stopped serving. Odalise stood frozen in the center of the dance floor, mascara starting to run, screaming at my son to fix it, to call the bank, to do something. My son just stared at his own wallet, understanding for the first time that every card in it was tied to accounts he did not actually control. Odalise had made a catastrophic miscalculation the moment she decided my son's mother was disposable. She saw a woman past 60 in a modest dress and assumed retirement savings, not an empire. She had no idea the estate she'd insisted on booking, the most exclusive venue on the coast, was one of 31 properties quietly owned by my holding company. I let her sign the contract. I let her feel powerful. I wanted to watch exactly how she'd behave once she believed she held all the cards. Through the panicked crowd, Bertrand and Celeste pushed forward, faces red with fury, entirely unbothered by the blood still drying on my cheek. Bertrand jabbed a finger toward me. "I don't know what stunt you think you're pulling, but I know judges in this county. I will sue you into the ground." Celeste snapped that I should get my hysterics under control and stop ruining a night that had nothing to do with me. I said nothing. I let their fury echo off the walls, filed it away, and walked out with my arm around myself, since my husband had passed 6 years earlier, and there was no one left to hold my hand through this but me. I did not go home that night. I told my driver to take me straight to the emergency room. In this state, striking a woman over 65 is not simple battery, it is felony elder abuse, and a documented medical record from a licensed physician is a weapon no amount of old money can erase. I sat in a sterile exam room and told the doctor exactly what happened and exactly who did it. I watched a nurse photograph the laceration and the bruising already blooming along my jaw. Every photograph was another nail. My phone rang while I was still in that exam room. It was my son, calling from the airport, where he and Odalys had been due to board a first-class flight to their 3-week honeymoon in the Maldives, a trip I had paid for in full. He was frantic, saying his card had been declined at the lounge, that the tickets had vanished from the system, demanding I fix the glitch. He actually used that word. I told him there was no glitch. I told him I had personally frozen every account tied to his name while riding to the hospital. I told him his access to the family trust was suspended indefinitely, effective the moment he chose silence over his own mother. He screamed that I was insane, that it was just an argument, calling the assault on my face an argument. I hung up and blocked his number. There is a particular kind of grief in realizing your child has become a stranger. I let myself feel it for exactly one night, then I went back to work. By 2 in the morning, Odalys had posted a video. Sitting on the edge of a motel bed with her makeup smudged just enough to look tragic, she told her hundreds of thousands of followers that her unhinged mother-in-law had attacked her out of jealousy over her youth and beauty, forcing her to defend herself. It was a masterclass in weaponized victimhood, and it worked. By morning, the video had 6 million views, and the comment section was a hurricane of cruelty aimed at a 68-year-old woman who had spent 30 years funding scholarships and community shelters. Pinned at the top of the comments was a message from my son's own verified account. He stood by his wife. He said no one should endure what Odalys had suffered. I read every comment beneath that video. Strangers who knew nothing about our lives called me bitter, jealous, unhinged, a washed-up old woman who couldn't stand her son finding happiness with someone younger and prettier. They demanded Odalys press charges against me. I did not cry reading those words. Anger has never served me well in business or in life. It clouds judgment at exactly the moment you need it sharpest. Instead, I felt the familiar, freezing calm that has carried me through every hostile negotiation I've ever survived. They were attacking a woman who had spent 3 decades quietly funding community health clinics and small business grants, and none of it mattered to a crowd that only wanted a spectacle. Public opinion has never once been interested in the truth. It is only ever interested in a good story, and Odalys told a very good story. That was the moment my son died to me completely. What none of those 6 million viewers knew was what had actually happened an hour before the ceremony. I had gone up to the bridal suite myself, carrying a small velvet box with a sapphire brooch that belonged to my late mother, meant as a welcome gift. I opened the door and found Odalys at the vanity with 3 bridesmaids, a rolled bill in her hand, a mirror dusted white in front of her. She wasn't nervous. She was laughing, bragging to her friends that she'd found a loophole in the prenuptial agreement, that after exactly 1 year of marriage, she could trigger a divorce clause and walk away with half of what she assumed was my son's $40 million inheritance. She called him a meal ticket. She called our family desperate strivers playing dress-up. I stood in that doorway and heard every word. I did not scream. I told her to fix herself up, pack quietly, and leave through the service entrance, and I promised to handle the wedding's cancellation with discretion. She looked at me, high and arrogant, and marched down to the ballroom instead, determined to force the day to continue on her terms. When I found her later to repeat my request privately, she panicked, realizing her payday was slipping, and struck first to create exactly the kind of chaotic, sympathetic spectacle she needed. 3 days after the wedding, my attorney, a sharp, unshakable woman named Corinne Vasquez, called to tell me Odalys and her father had filed suit, $12 million, claiming emotional distress, defamation, and false imprisonment over the locked doors. It was extortion wrapped in legal paper, and it gave me exactly the excuse I needed to open the vault, though they were never going to find money inside it. The meeting took place on the 40th floor of a glass tower I own through a subsidiary, in a conference room with views stretching out over the harbor. Odalys arrived 15 minutes late with a flashy litigator in an ill-fitting suit, and my son trailing behind her, refusing to meet my eyes. She sat down like a woman who believed she'd already won, demanding immediate release of the $40 million trust, $10 million earmarked for her personally as a settlement, the rest for her and my son to start a life away from this toxic family. She actually used the word toxic. I said nothing. I nodded once to Corinne, who slid a single manila folder across the table. She explained, in a voice calm enough to make the litigator lean forward to hear it, that the trust my son believed he controlled had never been his to demand. It was a fully discretionary generation-skipping trust, and he was merely a named beneficiary, entitled to nothing without approval from its sole trustees, myself and my late husband's sister. Every car, every apartment, every luxury my son had ever enjoyed had existed purely at our discretion, and that discretion had just run out. She thought her viral video had already softened us up, that the threat of a media firestorm would force our hand before we ever got to the fine print. She had no idea her own performance had done the opposite. Every dramatic frame of it had already been logged by my legal team as evidence of premeditation, timestamps, and all. The litigator's face went gray as he read it himself. Odalise slammed her palm on the table, insisting marital community property law entitled her to a share regardless, that her father would drag this through family court for a decade if he had to. Corinne simply flipped to page 31 and tapped a highlighted clause with the tip of her pen. She read it aloud. Any documented act of physical harm against either trustee by a beneficiary or their spouse triggers instantaneous, permanent disinheritance. No hearing required, no grace period, effective the moment the harm occurs. It had been triggered the second Odalise's diamond ring split my cheek open in front of 300 witnesses. The medical report from the emergency room was already attached to the trust dissolution filing. The litigator quietly closed his briefcase and began edging toward the door, realizing he'd taken a case with no client left to pay him. Odalise turned on my son with a viciousness that finally, mercifully, showed him exactly who she was. She hadn't married a man with $40 million. She'd married a man with nothing but a famous last name and an allowance that had just been revoked. The golden goose was empty. They left my building with no company car and no working credit cards, forced to call a rideshare with Odalise's own maxed-out card. She had it take them straight to the Cormorant Club, the private waterfront club, where her parents held court every afternoon, believing Daddy's name could still fix anything. What she didn't know was that her father's construction supply business had been quietly bleeding money for 5 years, propped up by risky short-term loans from 3 regional lenders desperate to get the debt off their books. 3 weeks before the wedding, I had authorized my private investment arm, operating under a shell entity with zero connection to my name, to buy every scrap of that debt at a steep discount. By the time Odalise walked down the aisle, I already controlled her father's entire financial existence. He simply didn't know it yet. When Bertrand tried to wire $500,000 to his daughter from the club's lounge that afternoon, his banking app returned a single line: "Account frozen, insufficient funds, contact your lender immediately." His face went pale as his own banker explained, voice shaking, that an unnamed creditor had just triggered an emergency default on every loan tied to his company, freezing every account he owned. Furious, Bertrand demanded the creditor's direct line and dialed it himself, expecting to bully a faceless bank employee into submission. The call rang through to my private office instead. I let him rage for a full minute before I spoke. I asked him, quite calmly, whether the wine at the Cormorant Club was still refreshing now that his accounts were empty. The silence on the line was absolute. I told him there was no trick, only the fact that I had spent 3 weeks quietly purchasing his entire company's debt while he was busy insulting my hospitality and my son's suitability. I told him he had 48 hours to produce the full balance in cash, or I would exercise my legal right to seize every asset attached to his name, including the historic waterfront house his family had owned for 4 generations. He did not last the 48 hours. He showed up at my office the next morning looking like a man who'd aged a decade overnight, begging for an extension, offering me a board seat, offering me anything. I told him I didn't want his failing company. I told him the price of mercy was his daughter. Within 24 hours, Odalise would record and post a full public retraction admitting she'd fabricated the assault claim, admitting to the drug use and the prenup scheme, and she would sign an annulment forfeiting any and all claims against my son or my estate. If she did it cleanly, I would restructure his debt into a manageable 10-year plan. If he tried to negotiate a single clause, I would liquidate everything he owned by sundown. He didn't hesitate. He took the papers and left to go break his daughter completely. That evening, 2 detectives arrived at my front gate. My stomach tightened for exactly a moment before I remembered I had done nothing wrong. It turned out Odalise, cornered and desperate, had walked into a police station and sworn out a statement claiming I'd sent armed men to threaten her at her motel, and repeated her original lie that I had attacked her first. I invited the detectives inside, poured them coffee, and walked them through my private security archive. Every property I own is wired with military-grade surveillance, audio included, because I host corporate events for clients who demand absolute discretion. I showed them the bridal suite footage, Odalise with the rolled bill, bragging about her scheme. I showed them the ballroom footage from 4 angles, her hand rising, the strike landing, her whispering to her mother seconds later that she was going to call the police and claim self-defense to squeeze a payout. It was premeditated on camera, in her own voice. The lead detective closed his notebook, apologized for the intrusion, and radioed his precinct to redirect the investigation entirely. 20 minutes later, a new warrant was signed. Odalise, unable to stay out of the spotlight even in crisis, had gone straight back to the Cormorant Club to hold court among her friends, recounting her fabricated version of events over champagne. The detectives walked directly onto that sunlit terrace in front of everyone she'd ever wanted to impress and arrested her. False police report, perjury, narcotics possession, felony elder abuse. She screamed for her father as they cuffed her. But Bertrand and Celeste had already packed 2 suitcases and fled the state that same night. Having learned federal investigators were closing in on years of tax, fraud, my forensic accountants had uncovered during the takeover of his company. My son found out about the arrest standing alone in that country club parking lot, holding Odalise's abandoned purse, which someone had shoved into his arms. Her phone was unlocked and lit up with a message from a man he didn't recognize. He opened it and found 6 months of messages between Odalise and an old family friend named Weston, describing my son as the naive one, bragging about the divorce scheme in explicit detail, mocking every part of him she'd claimed to love. He read it all sitting in the passenger seat of a friend's beat-up car, and something in him finally broke honestly, for the first time in his adult life. That night, in the middle of a violent coastal storm, he showed up at my gate soaked through, gripping the iron bars, begging to be let inside. He said he understood everything now, that he'd been manipulated, that he was sorry, that he wanted to come home. I sat in my study and watched him on the security monitor, and I felt no urge to run to him. I pressed the intercom and told him, as gently and as finally as I could manage, that an apology born only from losing everything is not remorse. It is regret at being caught in the consequences. I told him a man who watches his mother bleed and says nothing does not get to come running back the moment the money disappears. I told him to walk away. Then I cut the feed. I did not keep Bertrand's cormorant-adjacent business empire, once the debt was settled, or seize his family's coastal house for myself. I had no interest in occupying spaces built on other people's arrogance. I donated the proceeds of the entire recovered debt into a foundation supporting first-generation entrepreneurs of color trying to build something out of nothing, exactly the way I once did. I restructured my entire estate as well. No heirs left to inherit it, so it now funds scholarships and small business grants across 3 states, ensuring my legacy builds futures instead of funding arrogance. The trial took 3 months to reach the courtroom. Odalise sat at the defense table in a cheap gray suit, no designer anything left, her parents nowhere in sight, having fled the country entirely rather than face fraud charges of their own. I testified quietly, without theatrics, simply describing what happened and letting the medical records and the security footage do the rest. Her public defender, a tired man carrying a stack of case files far too thick for his caseload, tried to argue temporary psychological distress, claiming the pressure of a high-profile wedding had caused a sudden break with reality. It fell apart the moment the prosecutor played the bridal suite audio a second time for the jury, the one where Odalise calmly discussed the exact mechanics of the divorce clause while snorting a line off her own vanity mirror. You cannot claim a break with reality while simultaneously running the numbers on a $20 million payout. The jury took less than an hour to convict her on every count. The judge, a woman with little patience for privilege dressed up as innocence, sentenced her to 3 years without early release, calling her attempt to weaponize the police against an elderly woman one of the most calculated abuses of entitlement she'd seen in 2 decades on the bench. Odalise screamed for her father as the bailiffs let her out. He was not there, he was never coming. 6 months later, I was sitting on my porch with a glass of sweet tea, watching the tide come in, when a delivery van pulled up to my gate. My son stepped out in a faded work uniform, sweat-stained and tired, hauling a package up the driveway the way he used to help me carry boxes when he was a boy, before either of us had any money at all. He set the box down at the gate, looked up at the camera he knew was watching, and gave a single, quiet nod. No begging, no demands, just acknowledgement. I didn't buzz him in, but I smiled, because for the first time in his life, my son was learning the value of a single honest dollar, and that lesson was worth more than every account I'd ever frozen. This whole ordeal taught me something I already suspected, but never had to prove. Blood determines who you're related to, but loyalty determines who your family actually is. Too many of us are taught to swallow disrespect just to keep a fragile peace, told our boundaries are negotiable because we're older, because we're quieter, because we built things instead of demanding them. But peace bought with your own humiliation was never peace at all. When you stop funding the people who disrespect you, you don't lose a family. You simply take out the trash and reclaim the dignity you were always owed. Thank you for listening to my story today. If it gave you the courage to stand up to the toxic people in your own life, even the ones who share your last name, let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. Tell me what you think should happen to Odalise once she's out, and whether you think my son deserves a second chance. If you believe respect has to be earned and disrespect has to be answered, hit like and subscribe for more stories like this one. I'll see you in the next video.